India's coronavirus death toll has climbed to a grim new record after 3,689 deaths in the past 24 hours. The nation also saw another day of almost 400,000 new infections as it grapples with the growing crisis. One more state has been forced into lockdown, but the government remains reluctant to enforce nationwide measures. The country has expanded its vaccination program to all adults, but many states are struggling with shortages despite an export freeze. A lack of vaccines, medical supplies and hospital beds is plaguing the containment effort. More international aid arrived yesterday to alleviate the dire oxygen shortage. France sent 8 generator plants and 28 ventilators, adding to the ventilators that have arrived from Germany the previous night.
Myanmar security forces opened fire on protesters on Sunday, killing at least 8 people in some of the biggest demonstrations against military rule in days, 3 months after a coup plunged the country into crisis. Local media reported that the protests were coordinated with demonstrations in Myanmar communities around the world to mark what organizers called the Global Myanmar Spring Revolution. Streams of demonstrators made their way through cities and towns across the country, including the commercial hub of Yangon. The deaths reported by multiple local media outlets were spread out across different cities and towns. Reuters could not verify the reports, and a spokesman for the ruling junta did not answer calls seeking comment.
The easing of the lockdown has seen a spike in cash and transit robberies. What's even more worrying is that experts say well-organized and heavily armed criminals have adopted a shoot-to-kill mentality. The lives of security guards tasked with moving valuable assets are now at great risk.
Criminals are becoming even more brazen during cash-in-transit heists. One law enforcement and crime expert believes the majority of these crimes are committed by those who have inside information.
When we consider the possibility that cash-in-transit companies have been infiltrated by criminal elements, or that criminal elements have managed to bribe people in those companies, I would start there. I would start with those companies and ask them, urge them to rescreen all the personnel on their books.
They got guns. See, there's the one with the gun.
Many of the recent robberies have been committed in broad daylight, with criminals using deadly force.
In Latin America, journalism can be a dangerous profession. And now that includes reporting the truth about the COVID-19 pandemic. Sonny Figueroa works for Guatemala's independent investigative reporting outlet Vox Populi. Last year, he and a colleague began publishing reports about corruption during the pandemic that implicated close friends of the president.
That's when the president labeled us the terrible two. I was detained for 21 hours and beaten. We're now getting death threats and are being followed constantly.
A new study from Reporters Without Borders suggests that with the exception of Costa Rica and Uruguay, freedom of news media has diminished across the board since the pandemic began.
Officials called it a mass rescue operation that turned into a mass casualty event. A wooden people-smuggling boat capsizing and breaking into pieces off the coast of California. 4 people were killed and more than 24 injured.
A 12-metre cabin cruiser bouncing on a San Diego reef, hit by unrelenting waves. Within minutes, it completely disintegrates in the rough seas. Dangerous surf, freezing water temperatures and a crowded, poorly equipped vessel, a potent combination. 30 people were forced to swim for their lives.
6 to 7 people just got sucked out that rift and were just getting pulled out to sea.
A mass marine rescue operation unfolded and a special cliff apparatus was deployed as some survivors were smashed against the rocks. What was initially considered to be a fishing boat in trouble now appears to be something more sinister.
Every indication from our perspective is that this was a smuggling vessel.
John, I can tell you, unfortunately, that report is untrue.
White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain on Sunday denied a report by Iran state television that the two countries had reached a prisoner swap deal in exchange for the release of $7 billion in frozen Iranian oil funds under U.S. sanctions. Iranian state television on Sunday said that Tehran would free 4 Americans accused of spying in exchange for 4 Iranians held in the U.S. and the release of the frozen Iranian funds. But Klain, speaking on CBS's Face the Nation, said there's no deal.
We're working very hard to get them released. We raised this with Iran, but so far there's no agreement to bring these 4 Americans home.
Iran and world powers are holding talks to revive the 2015 nuclear accord that the Trump administration abandoned 3 years ago.
The numbers keep rising. Argentina, like the rest of Latin America, is suffering a second wave of COVID-19's infections and deaths. The government has imposed a further 3 weeks of new, tougher lockdown restrictions, a nighttime curfew and schools returning to online classes. The authorities say their main aim is to relieve the strain on hospitals. The arrival of vaccines has been slow and sporadic. The Argentinian government says it's doing all it can to find new supplies, but so far only a small percentage of people have had both jabs, the elderly and those with already serious health conditions. In the meantime, the only other option is to keep asking its people to be patient and cooperate.
Laporan Komandan Upacara.